Greetings to all the learners. Welcome to CEC lecture. The topic of analysis is Rise and Fall of Detente. We look at the topic with reference to a very significant event in the world history. In this lecture, we shall attempt to explain the Cold War, its meanings, its causes, and then elaborate on factors that were responsible for the rise as well as fall of detente. This lecture shall explain the significance of detente as a phase in the Cold War with reference to contemporary world history as well as its bearing with reference to understanding of international relations. In this lecture, we shall try to look at detente as an important phase in Cold War. We shall try to analyze the impact it had on diplomatic relations, and above all, what does the concept of rise and fall of detente, what does it hold in store for the power struggle as a feature of international politics? Detente can be defined as the process of normalization of relations and the development of friendly cooperation in place of strained, hostile or unhealthy or mutually harmful relations. Now, why does the idea of cooperation amidst harmful relations come into existence? Is because we have to understand detente with reference to the context that was the Cold War. Detente, as we all know, signifies easing of tensions, and this is specially used with reference to United States and the Soviet Union. The time framework for understanding this easing of tensions between the two superpowers, United States and the Soviet Union, the time framework is roughly late 1960s to late 1970s. The term detente comes from the French term détente, that means relaxation. Now, when we go by some popular accounts, popular remarks that we get at online search, US Presidents Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford called detente as thawing out of US Soviet nuclear diplomacy, and this was essential to avoid a nuclear confrontation. Now, we all know that USSR and United States had confrontation, though not direct, during the Cold War. But what was it that it reached the stage of nuclear confrontation? For that, we'll try to understand what was the Cold War. The Cold War was geopolitical tension between the Soviet Union and its satellite states, mainly the Eastern European countries, and United States and its allies, namely the Western European countries. Now, this geopolitical tension surfaces after the end of the Second World War. Post Second World War, the world got divided into two power blocks. The Cold War was a period of Soviet-American antagonism, and the time framework, dear learners, that we contrast and take into account for understanding the Cold War, the international system from approximately 1945 to 1991. There were ideological, political, economic, cultural, military and strategic contests between the two superpowers. Now, it's very important to study that whenever we are trying to study any phase of the Cold War, the rise of Cold War, detente, the end of Cold War, we must take into account that it is subject to constant reinterpretations, revisions based on new understanding, methodologies, academic research, perspectives, amongst others. Further, every phase of the Cold War and its related issues is open to multiple interpretations. Having said so, the competition between the two superpowers, the then USA, that was the leader for the capitalist countries, Soviet Russia, that was the leader for the communist countries. Taking the very popular definition by Hartman, that is, what is Cold War? As per Hartman, Cold War is a state of tension between countries in which each side adopts policies designed to strengthen it and weaken the other by falling short by actual war. Cold War is often referred as a diplomatic war. Why? Because, as it is argued, it was fought through other propaganda methods. And the main root cause that was leading this power tension between the two superpowers, the root cause was suspicion, lack of trust. Went further, as we just pointed out, that various phases of Cold War are open to reinterpretation. So, similarly, when we talk about origin of Cold War, there is no unanimity amongst the scholars regarding origin of the Cold War. Further, when we talk about causes of the Cold War, we all know the ideological differences, the ideological contrast between Soviet Russia and USA, the issue of race of armament between the two superpowers, the ideological differences were some of the primary causes of the Cold War. We take reference to a very important work by Odd Arne Westant, that is the name of the work, The Cold War, A World History. Now, in this work, when we go by the various accounts and narratives of the Cold War, one gets the sense that Cold War began. It can be situated around Europe, but it had deepest reverberations, great impact in Asia, Africa, Middle East. Then there was no doubt clash of ideology because every country somewhere had to choose sides. Geographically and chronologically, when we look in the book, it presents some very interesting narrative. That's how the Cold War comes up from ideology to arms race to amongst other issues. And it is very important that this clash of ideology somewhere has an important bearing in its role in creation of the contemporary world. Another important book that we take reference to explain Cold War, that is by Mervyn P. Leffler and Odd Arne Westant, The Cambridge History of the Cold War. Now, in this book, various aspects of Cold War are analyzed, namely processes of integration and disintegration, the arms race, role of intelligence, culture, national identities, amongst others. Now, in this reference, one gets the sense that the developments that made Cold War into a lasting international system during the 1960s and 1970s, how, somewhere one gets a sense that Cold War seemed to have stabilized after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the interesting arguments that have been made by the scholars with reference to it is that how interests and ideologies of the superpowers eroded the detente process. With this, one gets the sense that why was the term cold used? Because there was no actual war, no large scale fighting involving the two superpowers. When we talk about the Cold War, it is essential to understand the world that was there after the Second World War. We had the Potsdam Conference, which was held at Berlin in 1945 among US, UK, Soviet Union to discuss important issues, namely immediate administration of defeated Germany, demarcation of boundary of Poland, occupation of Austria, role of Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. Further, when we are talking about Potsdam Conference, we must understand that Soviet Union wanted some portion of Poland, if you go by some popular historical accounts. USA and UK didn't agree to this demand. Then further, there were debates on the nature of a bomb that was used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. Then this created suspicion in Soviet Union about the intentions of Western countries. This resulted in division of Germany through repatriations of each allied side's occupation zones, division of European countries between the US and USSR. The Truman Doctrine, which was announced on March 12, 1947 by the then US President Henry S. Truman to provide economic aid to other countries, also aided to causes that led to rise of Cold War. In 1946, at Westminster's College in Fulton, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill's famous word, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." Reading from this very important popular speech, we further find out that our supreme task and duty is to guard the homes of the common people from the horrors and miseries of another war. We are all agreed on that, said UK Prime Minister Churchill. In the same speech, that is Sinews of Peace, it is pointed out, and we quote, "On the other hand, I repulse the idea that a new war is inevitable, still more that it is imminent. What is needed is a settlement, and the longer that is delayed, the more difficult it will be and greater our dangers will become." Now, when we look at the Prime Minister Churchill's speech, Sinews of Peace, in this speech, how it is pointed out that somewhere the world was headed towards another war at the end of the Second World War. So, what we see here is that from Iron Curtain to arms race to clash of ideologies all led to rise of Cold War. Political, military and ideological barriers erected by the Soviet Union after the Second World War to seal off itself and its dependent Eastern and Central European allies from open contact with the West and other non-communist areas. Berlin blockade in 1948 was an attempt by Soviet Union to limit the ability of allied countries to travel to their sectors in Berlin. On 13th August 1961, the communist government of the German Democratic Republic began to build a barbed wire and concrete wall, the Berlin Wall, between East and West Berlin. So what we see here is that the division of Berlin Wall was one of the main bone of contention, and yes, this Berlin Wall fell, and this also marked the symbolic end to the Cold War. Further, when we look at the Marshall Plan with American Secretary of State George Marshall unveiling the European Recovery Program, which offered economic and financial help, followed by the Truman Doctrine, and how the Communiform, the Communist Information Bureau, was launched in 1947 as the Soviet response to Marshall Plan, and Marshall Plan was criticized as dollar imperialism. Further, formation of North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949, the Warsaw Pact in 1955 was signed between Russia and her satellite states, the space war and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Amidst this, what one finds here is that there was a realization that there may be a fear of the nuclear war. This made the two superpowers conscious of the need to limit the scope of the war. This marks that how there was progress of detente of 1970s. The Moscow-Bonn Agreement 1970, Treaty of Moscow was signed in August 1970 by the representatives of Soviet Union and West Germany, and the Article 1 therein said that the important objective of their policies is to maintain peace and achieve detente. They affirmed their endeavor to further the normalization of the situation in Europe. Further, the Berlin Agreement 1971, the Four Powers Agreement on Berlin, was signed by United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain and France. It re-established travel and communications between East and West Berlin and continued to the easing of tensions between the Western and Soviet blocs. The Korean Agreement 1972, it was a joint statement of the Republic of Korea and North Korea. It was issued on 4th July 1972. It called for an independent and peaceful reunification of the divided country. The East Germany-West Germany Agreement 1972, the end of war in Cambodia 1975, end of Vietnam War 1975, USA-China rapprochement and development of bilateral relations, the hotline. Further, the Third European Security Conference 1977, Camp David Accord between Egypt and Israel 1979, all of it paved way wherein there was relaxation of tensions between the superpower rivalry that we saw with the rise of the Cold War. There was no actual war during the Cold War, but there was an indirect war based on non-military and other sources, namely ideology, propaganda, economic warfare, space war, arms warfare, alliances, amongst others. The Cuban Missile Crisis, it reminded how had the crisis escalated, it presented before the world the fears of a nuclear war and fallout. In this scenario, the process of detente did lead to easing the tensions between the two superpowers. In the same light, the Helsinki Conference 1973 and Helsinki Agreement 1975, the conclusion of the first conference on security and cooperation in Europe, the Helsinki Final Act, where every European country except Albania signed the act in addition to the United States and Canada. The Helsinki Final Act dealt with a variety of issues divided into 4 baskets. Now, what were they? The first basket, the 10 principles covering political and military issues, territorial integrity, definition of borders, peaceful settlement of disputes, and the implementation of confidence building measures between opposing militaries. The second basket focused on economic issues like trade and scientific cooperation. The third basket emphasizing human rights, including freedom of emigration, reunification of families divided by internal borders, cultural exchanges, and freedom of the press. The fourth basket normalizing the details for follow-up meetings and implementation procedures. Now, there were further meetings of the same in Belgrade in 1977-78, Madrid 1980-83, Vienna 1986 and 89. Then further there were strategic arms limitation talks. There were 2 rounds of bilateral conferences and corresponding international treaties involving United States and the Soviet Union. Now, SALT I and SALT II, as they are popularly called, President Johnson called for strategic arms limitation talks round 1, and in 1967 he and the then Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin met at Glasgow State College in New Jersey, and they said that they must gain control, they pointed out, towards the issue of anti-ballistic missile race. Further, strategic arms limitation talks were, as we see, that how they pointed out at November 1974 Vladivostok summit that they agreed on basic framework of SALT II agreement, wherein somewhere, if you go by the inputs that we get from various internet resources, 2400 limit on strategic nuclear delivery vehicles. Now, one does see that there was easing down of tensions. However, detente as a phase in Cold War was short-lived. And this brings us to the next aspect, that what were the causes then that led to failure of detente? World did see that with strategic arms limitation talks, further with Helsinki Conference and Helsinki Agreement, end of war in Cambodia, the consequences of the Vietnam War, the Korean Agreement, the Berlin Agreement, establishment of hotline between USA and China, all of it was pointing towards that there is an easing down of tensions. But however, detente as a phase was short-lived. What were the causes then for failure or fall of detente? Firstly, rise of power politics again between the two superpowers. Towards the end of 1979, the two superpowers once again got involved in a Cold War, USSR's intervention in Afghanistan, and the new Cold War in 1980s. The new detente, the idea that there was a popular public opinion that there is a need to check the new Cold War. The world public opinion talking about nuclear arms race, how it must be talked, there is a need for disarmament, Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, 4-party agreement regarding the independence of Namibia, arms cut announced by Soviet Union, arms cut accepted by the USA were part of the new detente. Further, the end of Iraq-Iran war, amicable resolution of international disputes and war, all combined to secure a much needed improvement in the international environment of late 1980s. Then further, the INF Treaty 1987, the treaty between the United States of America and United Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, that is the INF Treaty, intermediate range nuclear forces. It required destruction of the parties' grounded, launched ballistic and cruise missiles with range between 500 and 5,500 kilometers, their launchers and associated support structures and support equipment within 3 years after the treaty enters into force. So, dear learners, we can say that D10 signified conscious and deliberate reduction of tension in mutual relations. Why it was important as a phase? Because it did show that there was reduction of superpower rivalry. There was reduction in division of world into two hostile camps that was witnessed during the Cold War. It did show reduction in Cold War tensions. Why was D10 significant? Because D10 paved way for normalization of relations. What was the outcome of it? One does find that there were important negotiations, important treaties relating to nuclear arms control, improved diplomatic relations amongst others. Though D10 was short-lived, though D10 did fall, however, one has to point out that it did pave way for a much needed relaxation of tensions in the world environment. It did pave way for normalization of relations, and one must look into D10 as a significant phase of the Cold War where there was reduction of tension in mutual relations and how it led to important negotiations and improvement in diplomatic relations. Dear learners, we hope that the lecture on Rise and Fall of D10 presented to you significant inputs and insights. We look forward to positive, encouraging feedback from you all for the lecture. Thank you very much.